If you were into your shooters in the early to mid-2000s, particularly those with a bit of science fiction flair, then it's highly likely that at some point you'll have played Pandemic Studios' hit first- and third-person shooter series, Star Wars Battlefront. The two titles were released in 2004 and 2005 respectively, and put players in the boots of a selection of classes and troops from all sides of the conflict, as well as some fan-favourite characters if you were lucky, and tasked them with obtaining victory in battle in the galaxy far, far away. Both received a decent reception from both critics and fans, and there was a point in time where the first was the best-selling Star Wars video game of all time, so it seemed like a continuation of the series was assured. Star Wars Battlefront III was announced in 2006 and was well into development before it was unceremoniously canned by the powers that be at LucasArts. But why? Why on earth would the publisher toss aside such a lucrative franchise, especially when a third game was so close to being finished? How did the Battlefront series then end up in EA's grubby mitts? And is there a way I can get my hands on Battlefront 3 today?
I think it's about time we found out, don't you? I'm Ben from TripleJump, and this is the untold story of Star Wars Battlefront 3.
Before we get into what went wrong with Battlefront 3, it's probably worth taking a quick look at Battlefronts 1 and 2. Development of the first Battlefront title began in November 2002 down at Pandemic Studios in Westwood, Los Angeles. According to Greg Baroud, the game's executive producer, the vision for Battlefront was clear from the get-go. The team wanted to create an online shooter for PS2, Xbox, and PC that would give Star Wars fans the chance to experience battles and locations from each of the then 5 Star Wars films as if they were there themselves. The aim was to give wannabe Jedi the opportunity to do everything they'd seen on the big screen, from fighting in the trenches in the icy tundra of Hoth to manning a Republic gunship on Geonosis.
The design document ended up featuring 5 commandments pertaining to what the finished game needed to do. It had to be balanced, it had to encourage team play but also had to be a fun single-player experience, it had to fulfill the Star Wars fantasy, and perhaps most importantly, it had to give players the catharsis they all desired by allowing them to gun down Ewoks and Gungans with reckless abandon.
Lead designer Jens Andersson was somewhat battle-hardened by the game development process by the time he started work on Battlefront, and was sick of design documents that were too vague, too much like extended pitches, and more often than not, got dropped the second anything changed on the project. He was keen to ensure that Battlefront was all Pandemic dreamed it would be, and this led him to implement a development system that ensured each planned feature had a list of goals, requirements, and test cases behind it, each of which was so clear and detailed that even the biggest layman would be able to understand them. From there, the game had to be built, but despite Anderson's efforts to ensure as smooth of a ride as possible, the journey wasn't without its issues. By all accounts, Pandemic had access to tools which would allow them to create stunning animations and gorgeous, sprawling worlds which could be populated by legions of AI-controlled beings, but it was the early 2000s, and the hardware they were developing for simply wouldn't be able to handle their lofty visions. Bone counts, stop giggling back there, for each character model had to be minimized, and many would share identical animations just so that the processors inside the Xbox, PS2, and PCs of the time would be able to handle them, and computer-controlled units had to be used strategically so that it wouldn't mince players' CPUs. One area where the team was seemingly allowed to go wild, though, was the sound. After all, what is Star Wars without John Williams' iconic score, the gargling growl of a Wookiee, or the gentle hum of a lightsaber? According to sound designer Nick Peck, the developers at Pandemic knew that without authentic sounds, the experience would fall apart, so not only did they pull sounds from the movies, augmenting them in the process to ensure that they meshed with the game, but they also took the time to painstakingly create 1,200 Foley sounds for use in Battlefront to ensure that everything, from footsteps to the rattling of armor, sounded just right.
Star Wars Battlefront was officially announced on January 13th, 2004. Demos for Xbox and PS2 featuring the Battle of Endor were later included with the Star Wars Trilogy DVD set and PlayStation Magazine, respectively, and the full game was released in September 2004.
The response to the game was very positive. Star Wars Battlefront garnered review scores between 76 and 83 out of 100, depending on the platform and whether you're looking at game rankings or Metacritic, and it earned praise from reviewers for everything from its graphics and sound to its online multiplayer. And though the NPCs were derided for being a little stupid at times, on the whole it was considered a great experience. Good enough to warrant a sequel at least. And so, development on the second Battlefront began almost as soon as the first game shipped, and the team down at Pandemic had a quandary on their hands. How do you take everything that was great about the first game and make it bigger, better, and more exciting? The answer? You throw in space battles, of course.
Not only would players be able to engage in dogfights in outer space, but they'd also be able to land their starfighter aboard an enemy ship, then get out and continue the fight on foot.
Because it was releasing after Star Wars Episode III Revenge of the Sith debuted in cinemas, Battlefront II would also include battles from that movie, and not just the ones seen extensively on screen, but those cinema-goers only caught a glimpse of too. A little over a year after the launch of the first game, Battlefront II was released for PC, Xbox, PS2, and PSP, and though the PSP version didn't quite review as well, on all other platforms the game was considered a triumph. It outscored its predecessor on both PS2 and Xbox, and players were pleased to find that everything they loved about the original had been carried over to the sequel, whilst the addition of space battles kept things fresh and interesting. It seemed like everything was coming up Star Wars Battlefront, and so another sequel just made sense, didn't it? It wasn't until September 2006, almost a year after the release of Star Wars Battlefront II, that the world got any sort of news regarding a follow-up, and the news fans did receive was somewhat shocking. As reported by CVG on the 29th of September 2006, Pandemic Studios, who had been at the helm of the first two games in the series, would not be developing Star Wars Battlefront 3, and instead Nottingham-based studio Free Radical Design would be picking up the mantle. This was a surprise to many, but not necessarily an unwelcome one. After all, Free Radical was founded by ex-Rare staff and had made a name for themselves in the early 2000s thanks to the brilliant Time Splitters franchise, a series of first-person shooters which each garnered critical acclaim. As such, the studio seemed well-positioned to take on the third Battlefront title. Why LucasArts chose to shun Pandemic Studios in favor of Free Radical isn't 100% clear, especially considering what a great job Pandemic had done with the first two Battlefront games. According to Free Radical co-founder Steve Ellis, LucasArts were big fans of the studio's work, plus the founders had a good working relationship with both LucasArts president Jim Ward and vice president of product development Peter Hirschman. So, by the sounds of it, Pandemic didn't do anything wrong. Free Radical may well have just had the right friends in the right places.
By all accounts, Free Radical were tentative about going into a partnership with LucasArts. After all, in the past they'd only ever developed games for which they owned the intellectual property, or at least part-owned, so taking on a completely third-party IP was brand new territory for them.
At the time, however, Free Radical were hard at work on Haze, a first-person shooter set in a dystopian future, and things weren't exactly going to plan. Despite the game having been announced for Xbox 360 and PC, publisher Ubisoft, with whom Free Radical co-owned the IP, decided it would be a PS3 exclusive, which put a lot of pressure on the devs and, due to the prospect of delays, financial strain on the studio. Taking on Battlefront 3 wasn't just an opportunity for the developers at Free Radical to work on a beloved franchise, it was keeping them out of monetary hot water too. And so, Free Radical got to work on Battlefront 3, a game which was the most ambitious they'd ever attempted. Just as Battlefront 2 needed to be bigger and better than Battlefront 1, so too did Battlefront 3 need to be bigger and better than Battlefront 2. The vision was to create a game where players could be in the midst of a boots-on-the-ground battle planetside, then get into a ship, take off, and engage in a space battle. Sounds great, but the issue faced by the studio was the sheer scale of the undertaking. If the idea is to be able to seamlessly transition from ground-based action to interstellar travel, the environments would have to be absolutely massive. Not only that, but said massive environments would also need to be populated by characters, buildings, vehicles, and more. It was certainly going to be a tough nut to crack, but Free Radical felt that they were up to the task. Development kicked off in mid-2006 and continued until 2008, at which point Steve Ellis and Free Radical co-founder David Doak began to worry that the timescales imposed on the devs were looking a bit tight. This wasn't too much of a worry for them. They were on good terms with Jim Ward after all, so surely he'd be understanding. right?
He probably would have been. Unfortunately, he stepped down from his position in February 2008. Oh dear.
Almost overnight, the keystone of Free Radical's relationship with LucasArts was gone, but Free Radical still felt that they'd done the right thing in conveying their concerns about milestones to the publisher. Unfortunately, Battlefront III was already on thin ice with the powers that were over at LucasArts. The publisher didn't have a great deal of faith in Ward's vision, and with him gone, Free Radical were left to deal with a group of executives they didn't know and who weren't particularly interested in the game they were developing. Ward's departure wasn't the only change LucasArts was facing. At the beginning of 2008, a new company strategy meant that the publisher needed to cut its outgoings in half. A whole layer of management was removed entirely, and various projects were cancelled. Suddenly, the people Free Radical were working with at LucasArts weren't those interested in making great games, they were people whose only mandate was to control costs.
Still, development of Battlefront 3 chugged along, but despite the game not being cancelled, it felt to Free Radical like the new faces at LucasArts were doing everything in their power to make life difficult for them. Although Free Radical were hitting milestones, LucasArts were seemingly finding any reason not to sign off on them, and because of this, Free Radical weren't getting paid by the publisher.
Co-founder Graham Norgate speculated that LucasArts planned to squeeze as much free work out of Free Radical as possible, then pass the assets on to Rebellion Studios to provide a much quicker, much cheaper version of Battlefront 3. Though, unsurprisingly, LucasArts has never admitted to this. LucasArts was also putting pressure on Free Radical to cut several members of staff. After taking on the contracts with Ubisoft and LucasArts, Free Radical had, naturally, expanded so that there would be enough people on staff to actually get the work done. LucasArts didn't see people, though. All they saw were numbers to be crunched, and when Free Radical pushed back on their demands, the publisher started to pull away. Now, in theory, the contract between Free Radical and LucasArts should have protected either party in the event that the other no longer wished to proceed with the project. However, Free Radical was now in dire financial straits. LucasArts hadn't been paying them, if you recall, and they soon realized that if the publisher did decide to can Battlefront 3, they wouldn't be able to afford the lengthy legal proceedings that came part and parcel with upholding a breach of contract claim. And you know who else soon realized this? LucasArts. Despite the fact that, by this point, Battlefront 3 was well on the way to being finished, the publisher wanted out, and so they presented Free Radical with a choice. Either accept a much smaller payment and simply walk away from Battlefront 3, or try your luck in court knowing you don't have the money to see such a thing through. Free Radical were backed into a corner, and the only thing they could do was to accept LucasArts' offer and hope that, with the little money they had, they'd be able to find something new to work on, and quickly.
But what about Haze, you might be wondering? Wasn't that released in May 2008? Did it not help with Free Radical's financial situation somewhat? Were there not more opportunities to be had working with Ubisoft? Well, the answer to those three questions would be yes, no, and also no.
Prior to its release, the Haze hype train was chugging down the track at full pelt, with some outlets saying it had the potential to be a Halo killer. Alas, upon its release, Haze was not well received, with critics lambasting its plot, gameplay visuals, short single-player campaign length, and myriad bugs and glitches. Time was running out for Free Radical, and if they didn't find a new project and fast, it would be lights out for the developer. Throughout summer 2008, the studio attempted to get publishers on board with Time Splitters 4, even producing a prototype to show their plans for the game, but no one was interested in investing in Free Radical due to the failure of Haze. It would seem that it doesn't matter how many good games you've developed in the past, you could produce several great games, then churn out one slightly subpar offering, and suddenly you're a complete pariah. But then, just as closure seemed assured, a knight in shining armor arrived. It was Activision, with an offer of a follow-up to GoldenEye 007. Yeah, who'd have thought they could be the heroes of this story? The devs had hope once again, and they began pulling together ideas for a GoldenEye remake for PS3 and Xbox 360, eager to show the publisher how keen on the idea they were. It turns out, however, that Activision are no heroes, wow, who'd have thought it, and almost as quickly as the offer was made, it was rescinded again. With no cash left and no project lined up to bring any in, Free Radical Design went into administration on the 12th of December 2008, the same day as their annual Christmas party. Steve Ellis recalls the day in vivid detail, telling Eurogamer in 2012 that he remembers Free Radical staff approaching him at the party to thank him for the Christmas bonuses they'd received and tell him how much they loved working for the company. Soon after, 140 people lost their jobs, and in the end, Free Radical was purchased by Crytek. They did make a brief return in 2021, resurrected as a subsidiary of Deep Silver, but the studio was once again shuttered on the 11th of December 2023. This means that the poor staff at Free Radical were shut down at Christmas twice. Blimey. It would seem that the game really is over for Free Radical Design, and the likelihood is that we'll never get our hands on the fabled Time Splitters 4, or even Star Wars Battlefront 3 for that matter.
Such a shame. I really do wish I could try it for myself, but there's just no way, unless somebody uploaded a build to the internet perhaps. Oh, they did?
While various clips and leaked snippets have emerged over the years from Free Radical's Battlefront 3, it wasn't until December of 2024 that a fully playable build was made available to all, courtesy of modding group Free Radical Archive. This Wii version follows the earlier uploading of a barely functioning Xbox 360 edition, and through meticulous digging and research, the team managed to pull together what could be the final Wii build of the game, dated just 1 week prior to its cancellation. So, how is it? Well, it's understandably quite rough in places, but it's all here and was seemingly well on its way to being completed. The main menu offers up multiple options: arcade, multiplayer, training, and story campaign. Arcade is the home of returning favorites like Galactic Conquest, where you must compete against a friend or the computer to conquer planets and take over the galaxy. Instant action is also available should you want to hop straight into a game of conquest, heroes versus villains, or new game mode Hunt, in which the hunted must survive being wiped out by the hunters. The free play menu, interestingly, has a seemingly random selection of all sorts, including AI and animation test rooms, but most of the options in this menu would crash the game. Multiplayer is fully implemented in this build, albeit split screen only, but as I have no friends, I couldn't try it. Similarly, the training menu contains a series of videos, none of which would play, apart from the first option that is, which bizarrely and incidentally is also the first mission of Battlefront 3's story campaign. In one of many firsts for Free Radical's swing at the Battlefront series, Battlefront 3 was due to have an original campaign, and you know what? It's all here, all 12 missions complete with cutscenes and voice acting. Well, I'd say it's all here. The voice acting is clearly placeholder, with a lot of clone troopers sounding South African for some reason.
I'm telling you, the way I see it, this thing would be able to make 0.5 postcards. That's not a piece of junk to make.
The objectives are often unclear, the cutscenes sometimes don't trigger, and when they do occasionally have no sound. Every character with a cape has it stretched upwards towards the ceiling in upsetting fashion. The AI balancing causes your enemies to be untouchable gods 1 minute and drooling imbeciles the next, and far too many objectives involve simply killing all foes in a given area, which gets quickly repetitive. But enough of all the bad stuff. What's the story about? Battlefront 3's story campaign follows two clones named X1 and X2. While the individual they're clones of are not known, the pair serve as instructors to the clone troopers before themselves being called into battle when the Clone Wars begin. Assuming control of X2, players are subjected to constant belittling from X1, whose arrogance quickly swells across the game's opening missions as he believes himself both better than X2 and also the Jedi they serve under. As Order 66 is given, the pair ultimately split up, with X2 refuting the commands of his superiors and questioning the ham-fisted approach to eliminating a Jedi in hiding, civilians be damned. Oh, and that Jedi they were sent to kill? Turns out he sought aid on Kamino many years before and was secretly cloned, with X1 and X2 being the result. The story continues with Luke Skywalker ultimately assisting X2 with his emerging Force abilities and training him in the ways of the Jedi before the pair thwart the plans of a now Sith-flavored X1 to create a Force-powered clone army, but you can read about that in your own time. Ultimately, it's an interesting and original take on the pre-Disney Star Wars universe, and as we'll no doubt be saying a lot in this video, it's just a shame to never see it fully realized. How does it play, you ask? Well, it's a Wii game, I reply through gritted teeth, and it controls like a Wii game. For the most part, it's playable, at least. Mercifully, the motion controls and gestures are kept to a minimum, with the Wii Remote used for looking, turning and aiming, and the nunchuck used for movement. Additionally, the Z button is used for locking on, which alleviates a lot of frustration, but it doesn't undo it all. On-foot combat works okay then, unless you're wielding a lightsaber, in which case the Wii Remote does not let you look, vehicle controls are the worst as the Jedi control woes carry over, and aircraft actually control the best, with most starfighters banking and cutting through space with relative ease. Speaking of which, a huge point in Battlefront 3's favor is the much-touted so-called full Battlefront experience, allowing you to start in space or on planet and fly interchangeably between the two. Is it rough looking? Yeah, of course it is. The effects aren't all in there, and you can see the square outline of playable planet quite clearly. But hopping into an X-Wing or similar and emerging from the hangar into the inky expanse of space before engaging in a bit of dogfighting and then soaring down to the planet below is an undeniably cool feature that we've yet to see replicated. What stuck out to me is how Free Radical may well have been building towards a far more tactical approach to these battles too. Each space station contains consoles for external and internal turrets, complete with shield cores and numerous winding corridors. You can really see how a small team of defenders and infiltrators might battle it out within each other's home destroyers while a larger ground force tries to capture the planet below. This build of Star Wars Battlefront 3 isn't in the best shape. It's missing the minimap entirely, spacecraft fly out of navigable space, making them impossible to take down. It nearly continuously plays a robotic voice saying, "This is a blank placeholder sound." And if there's more than one lightsaber wielder within a given area, the humming resonance of the weapon seemingly reproduces endlessly, resulting in a deafening din like you're standing in the middle of a Formula 1 Grand Prix. However, it shows a lot of promise. From the original story campaign to the new hunt mode, the full Battlefront approach to battles, the ability to ride Tauntauns, fight as Ewoks, battle on new planets like Coruscant and Dathomir, or play as new heroes and villains including Sam Wessel, Padme, and Dark Troopers, it's very apparent that Free Radical were doing everything they could not only to differentiate themselves from Pandemic's previous offerings, but to take the series to entirely new frontiers. If they'd have been allowed to complete their work, we quite possibly could have ended up with a game that's held in even higher regard than the original two games in the series, and that's quite the accolade. Alas, it was cancelled, and this rough yet promising feature-complete build is all we have to go by.
Woo! Woo! Hooray! Woo! Hey!
A tantalizing glimpse at what if then, but as we know, this was not the end of Star Wars Battlefront's story, as next came EA.
The good news for fans of Karma, but bad news for people who don't want to see an iconic gaming entity closed down, is that LucasArts was shuttered in all but name in 2013, after everyone's favourite anthropomorphic mouse came along and purchased the Star Wars franchise, and everything else under the Lucasfilm umbrella for that matter, and started shuffling things around behind the scenes. Indeed, when Disney bought Lucasfilm in 2012, they took the decision to farm out video game development to third parties, leaving LucasArts to handle the licensing side of things. By May 2013, Disney had signed an agreement with EA, giving them the exclusive rights to publish Star Wars games developed by DICE, Visceral Games, and BioWare.
Just a month later, at E3 2013, EA announced the confusingly titled Star Wars Battlefront : a game which was to be neither a remake of the original Battlefront nor a sequel to the second game, but a reboot of the franchise.
In October of the following year, it was announced that Star Wars Battlefront would be releasing during the holiday season in 2015, which just so happened to be when Star Wars The Force Awakens would be debuting in cinemas. Naturally, this being an EA venture, the developers had to scramble to get the thing finished, ditching the single-player campaign experience in the process. But Battlefront did indeed wind up releasing in November 2015, just in time for Christmas, and right before Rey, Finn, Poe, and all those other new characters nobody gives a toss about made their big-screen debuts. The response to EA's reboot was somewhat tepid, with critics offering praise to the overall atmosphere and generally agreeing that developer DICE had captured the feel and look of the galaxy far, far away, but deriding the shallow gameplay that was a huge departure from what Pandemic had served up a decade prior. Still, by the end of 2015, more than 12 million copies of Battlefront had been sold, plus EA hadn't really allowed their scum and villainy to shine, so a sequel was in order. Star Wars Battlefront II, again no colon, was announced in May 2016, and before the game was even released, EA were in hot water. You see, during pre-launch beta trials, gamers quickly realized that Battlefront 2 was absolutely riddled with microtransactions. Now, had these simply been microtransactions for cosmetic items, people probably wouldn't have been all that mad, but it turned out that the loot boxes contained items which would give those who purchased them substantial gameplay advantages. The credits used to buy the loot boxes could technically be earned in-game, but the awarding of them wasn't tied to player performance and instead to the number of matches participated in, which led some to use rubber bands to make it look like they were playing while they were actually doing the ironing, ruining the experience for others. It gets worse though, because Reddit users did the maths on unlocking Darth Vader through gameplay alone and found out that it would take a whopping 40 hours of grinding to be able to access that one character. Of course, EA being EA, they swooped in and made the whole situation worse, defending the lofty credit requirement by saying that their intent was to give players a sense of pride and accomplishment for unlocking a character. This went on to be the most downvoted comment in Reddit history, earning a Guinness World Record in the process. Where's your pride and accomplishment now, EA?
The day before Battlefront 2's release, EA took the decision to remove paid loot boxes and microtransactions from the game entirely, but the damage was done. The company lost over $3 billion in stock value by the end of November 2017, and several governments around the world had begun investigating whether loot boxes constituted gambling and needed to be regulated as such.
Aside from a cancelled spin-off codenamed Viking, we've heard nothing further from the Battlefront series since the Battlefront 2 loot box scandal, and at this point, it's starting to look like we never will. It turns out that the downfall of Star Wars Battlefront 3 and indeed of Free Radical design was a tale as old as time. A small studio who were used to doing things for themselves took a chance on a big publisher who wound up, as is often the case, prioritizing profits and stabbing the developer in the back. What happened to Free Radical was a travesty in and of itself, but the fact that Star Wars Battlefront 3 was shaping up to be an absolutely brilliant game makes the whole thing sting 1,000 times worse. At the time, the original Battlefront was the best-selling Star Wars game ever, so surely the execs knew that Battlefront 3 would have been monstrously successful. Why on earth did they not just give Free Radical a little extra time to cook, rather than royally shafting them and fans of the franchise all in the name of cost-cutting? It makes you want to grab hold of those video game execs and give them a good shake, doesn't it? The silver lining here, of course, is the fact that after so many years, the Wii build of Battlefront 3 is at least now available for anyone to enjoy. Well, provided they know their way around an emulator, of course. And thanks to the efforts of the good folks at Free Radical Archive, at some point in the not-too-distant future, it may well be finished.
For now, however, we're left to wonder what might have been. What if Jim Ward hadn't left LucasArts? What if Disney had never spent the $4.05 billion to acquire Star Wars? What if EA hadn't gotten their grubby mitts on the Star Wars license? And what if Free Radical was allowed to complete their work on Battlefront 3 and hadn't developed Haze? Sadly, we'll never know for sure.